Hello, I'm Gus Downing, publisher and editor of the D&D Daily, and this is the LP News Network. Today's session is entitled, The Challenges of Doing Business in Mexico. And with us to discuss it is Jim Carr, CFI, CCIP, and Senior Director, Asset Protection for Rent-A-Center, Inc. With a BA degree in law and justice, Jim has over 25 years of retail asset protection experience and is leading the international and U.S. effort for Rent-A-Center. Rent-A-Center operates more than 2,600 locations in 2,000 Acceptance Now kiosks in 50 states, Washington, D.C., Canada, and Puerto Rico. Over the last 6 years, Jim has managed the rollout of 190 locations in Mexico for Rent-A-Center, and currently they operate 125 locations. With this background, Jim now has the entire retail life cycle of experience in Mexico, from market entry to managing successful locations to closing stores down. Jim has gained some invaluable international experience and can speak directly to the challenges of doing business in Mexico. And with that, Jim, thanks for taking the time today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Gus.
Let's talk about entering the market and look at this from a steps perspective and the process you go through and making sure your stores are protected and the employee population is well screened and trained. In what about vendor selection, pre-employment screening, and hardening the physical store security itself? And that's a huge package.
It is. First, let me just say that I'm honored to be here today and share with my insights on the challenges of Mexico. There's been a lot of observations and experiences that I've had over the past 6 or 7 years, being fortunate enough to be involved in the international arena. Mm-hmm. And those opinions that I provide today aren't necessarily those of my current employer.
Right.
Duly noted. So as we move forward with your question, market entry is a little bit different. It's very typical. First of all, you have to scout your area that you're going to go into. There's typical risk assessment process when you look at that as well. Training is very similar to the States from that standpoint. I can tell you that most of the retailers that I've seen that go into market, they will do some mass training as they go into one particular city or one market, whether it be Guadalajara, Mexico City, Monterrey, etc. And when you think about the vendor community and the resources that you have there, it's a little bit different. So from an employee screening standpoint, there are no central repositories like we are fortunate enough to have here in the United States. To put some perspective on that, it's estimated that 3 to 5% of all crimes are actually reported in Mexico. Mm-hmm. So with that in mind, even if there was a central repository, what type of information are you actually going to get from it?
Yeah, you wouldn't have the data.
No, correct. So from there, it's a bit of a challenge. So it really comes down to a very thorough process around the screening process as far as validating your employment, referrals, and I would tell you that for those folks that have some type of interview and interrogation training, to be able to detect deception during the interview process is very critical as well. There's a lot of front-end manual skills that go into the selection process for coworkers.
Did you spend a lot of time then helping to train some of the store management or the district managers on interviewing applicants and trying to refine those skills they had and build on them?
We shared that information. The interview and interrogation process in general is even fairly new to the LP professionals in Mexico. Mm-hmm. So culturally, their model is quite a bit different than we are here in the States. I would say that model is very driven off of physical security mm-hmm. and auditing mm-hmm. for the most part. So, but to go back to your vendor selection process, it's good to reach out to any of the vendors that you have here in the U.S. that have a counterpart or presence in Mexico and do business. They could do the introductions and help facilitate that process. It is also good to join some good networking groups to be able to benchmark and share best practices with other fellow retailers. I can tell you there's a handful of retailers at the conference we're at today that actually were very beneficial in providing some insight and benchmarking information as we worked on our strategy to implement physical security, how to build our model, and how to make it successful.
Did you have to increase the training? Really kind of emphasize it a little more at all?
Yes, because the loss prevention or asset protection, even the total loss concept, is fairly different in Mexico culturally than it is domestically here within the U.S. So I could even speaking to one example would be just even with my current employer, we're a rent-to-own retail model. I mean, the rent-to-own concept in retail was totally new. We were the first ones to make market entry. So we had a lot of teaching and education was a big focus for our, I could tell you that the asset protection team was very involved. In Mexico, we would participate anywhere from 6 to 8 hours during the orientation process. The orientation process would be a week long when we'd go into a market for all new coworkers, and we would have one particular day where it would be everything: asset protection, physical security, operational audit, etc.
So the bottom line is LP is much more involved in the basics of opening a store, much more integrated.
I would tell you that compared to our domestic model, our hierarchy is different. The amount of stores that you cover are different. It's a much smaller store count in Mexico. So from that perspective, your involvement in the day-to-day details and getting into the weeds and physically being in a store, coaching and training is much greater in that atmosphere than it is for us here domestically.
Right.
Correct.
Now, did the State Department offer any assistance or help, the United States State Department or the embassy and such?
Yeah, so there's a group called the Overseas Security Advisory Council, or the acronym of OSAC, and it's a fabulous group. It is the State Department, all the U.S. embassies and consulates that are throughout the world outside the U.S. borders. In the larger cities, they have a RSO, which is a regional security officer, and that person's role is really to speak to all of the business, American-based businesses that are conducting business in their markets, to provide insight, information, challenges. They are not allowed to recommend any particular vendors or any type of products or services, but there are times when they're willing to share where their employees or coworkers, what hotels do they stay at, what parts of the city are they only allowed to reside in. Some of that information is very valuable.
From a risk assessment standpoint.
Correct, correct. Especially when you're looking at mitigating your risks and minimizing them. It's also good to look at, who do they use from a vendor perspective. If the U.S. government, they're taking great efforts to be able to vet the vendors that they're doing business with.
From a store opening process, is there anything unique or different than that of opening stores in the U.S.?
I would just say that probably the overall model is quite a bit different. When you take a look at the U.S. domestic model, it's a typical program is driven off of data analytics, audit and training, physical security investigations. When you go outside U.S. and you get into the international market, you really have to incorporate a global security component to your program. So whether that be protective intelligence and how you keep your coworkers safe as they travel throughout the country, how do you keep them in areas that are safe and they avoid high-risk markets. Executive protection it becomes a part of your program as well, protecting not your executives, some of your senior management staff as they visit or work throughout the country. And then for the folks out there, you have to think about what type of program are you going to put in place. So are you going to go with a high profile model from an executive protection standpoint? So some folks like all of the Suburbans and the armored vehicles and the guys with the sunglasses that all look like they're work for the federal government, or are you going to go low profile? Are you going to blend in? For me personally, my opinion is low profile, blend in, especially when you spend a lot of time there and you are kind of fair skinned and have blonde hair, you could stick out quite a bit. So it's better to blend in, a member kind of middle management. There's a lot of folks that come in and out of Mexico that are there for the week. They're on contract. Sure. They go home on the weekends or they stay for 2 weeks. So you try to blend in and fit into a different model from that perspective. And when you're using vehicles, you want to have middle of the road 4-door Suburbans. You don't want big flashy vehicles because you don't want to show any signs of wealth when you're traveling there. So.
So you've got the stores open, you're doing your audits, you're doing your cases. How do you communicate? How do you resolve internal, external theft cases, increase store performance, and deliver good shrink numbers?
That's pretty interesting. So we talked a little bit earlier about the Mexican model is a little bit different. So it's very driven off of physical security as well as an auditing process. And we talked also about the judicial system is a challenge in Mexico. With 3 to 5% of the actual crimes being reported, there's not a lot of deterrence from a coworker perspective on whether or not they should get involved in internal theft, or even customers getting involved in theft and fraud activities. So if there's not a big deterrent with the judicial system, if there's not any consequences related to that, what is it that would actually deter a coworker from getting involved, from taking 15 pesos from a till or taking some product from your stockroom? So it really just comes down to a paycheck. People like to be able to generate cash and have money in their wallet and be paid for the services that they provide. So to not have that physical paycheck or be paid on a weekly basis, that is somewhat of a deterrent, believe it or not. So when you think about that, it's a little bit different. So also very common in Latin America is, and for this example, is, it is fairly common throughout Latin America. If you have an audit team that comes into your store and they audit your cash till and it's 20 pesos short, the cashier is responsible for that. Doesn't mean they're going to necessarily lose their job. It just means there's a consequence to that. If your deposit is short, there's a good possibility that the people responsible for preparing the deposit are going to have to reimburse the organization for that. If they go into your stock room and they realize that you're missing 15 TVs and they do an inventory as part of the audit process and they're missing, then it's probably your management team is going to be responsible for that as well. So that's kind of the deterrence and the consequence that could come with it.
Significant.
And so it's a bit different than what the consequences here domestically for us in the U.S.
Right.
Yeah.
When it comes to high shrink stores, does the typical high shrink store program fit there, or do you make adjustments? Are there any variances from a typical one?
I would tell you that if I were going into Mexico and opening gym stores, they would all be Target stores. You have to, in Mexico, your strategy has to be, you don't want any soft targets. You want to be a hard target. If you're going into a strip center, you obviously have to do your assessments so you can mitigate your risks. You have to look at the security thresholds in the standards that are put in place, and you have to ensure that if the bar is set here, that you're right above the bar. You don't want to be an easy target. Right. It's very unfortunate, but for a lot of the local Mexican national folks that are smaller, the mom and pops, and the smaller chains that don't have as much capital behind them for some of the mitigation measures, some of the physical security measures, it's unfortunate for them. They tend to be more of the targets for violence, crime, extortion, et cetera.
Yeah. Let's talk about closing stores. Any increased risk associated here? The announcements are coming out of corporate, to the public that they're closing the stores. Certainly you've got to take some extra measures.
You do. I would say it's probably not that much different, the overall process, than you would experience here in the U.S. You typically, obviously, you have to make sure your consumer base knows that your location is closing, and whereas the nearest location they can get your products and services. It's also recommended that whoever is going to lead the store closing process, that I would recommend that they would be someone who's going to be retained with the organization, and they have an opportunity to be transferred to a local area, et cetera, and they've got some skin in the game. Right. If they're not going to be retained with your organization, then there's really not a lot of deterrence for them not to be involved in deviant behavior at the workplace, or to stop those other folks that may make a decision to take that route as well.
So how is it at the director level in managing the LP program, especially from a Foreign Corruption Practices Act standpoint?
It all comes down to education, whether it is your coworkers that work for you domestically in the U.S. that are flying into a foreign country, they need to understand what the Foreign Corruption Practice Act is. Or whether it, for example, we're talking about Mexico, so we've got, if you're Mexican nationals that are working for a U.S.-based organization, they need to understand also and be trained on what the Foreign Corruption Practice Act is, because anyone's behaviors and decisions could lead to issues or violations which are pretty extreme from a penalty and fine standpoint. Just understanding the difference between a facilitation payment and a bribe is pretty significant. So, there are a lot of programs out there that you can buy kind of off the shelf. They'll customize them for you as well. And I would say that it's probably customary for all organizations to go through an annual training every year as a refresher.
That's smart.
Yeah.
Jim, thanks for being here today.
Hey, it's been great. Thank you very much.
Well, that's it for this episode, ladies and gentlemen. We'd like to thank you for watching. And until next time, let's keep them all safe out there.